弟兄姊妹早晨，我係鄺牧師。如果你識廣東話，咁你會知我講緊咩啊？我嘅中文唔係幾好，不過你會識。如果你唔識廣東話，咁你都唔知我講緊咩啊。So, if you speak Cantonese, you would have understood what I said, even though my Cantonese is very much out of practice. If you are someone who doesn't speak or understand Cantonese, what did you do? What did you think? This morning, our devotional series in the book of Psalms brings us to Psalm 77. Now, before we get into the content and some of the key thoughts of this psalm, I want to draw our attention to something very interesting. Depending on what translation you're using, the Hebrew word Selah appears 3 times, at the end of verses 3, 9, and 15. The NIV, the New International Version, doesn't include this word, but it does make a footnote indicating that in the Hebrew text, this word does appear. Selah is a Hebrew word that nobody is really quite sure exactly what it means. In fact, Selah, the way we read it in English, is actually just a transliteration of the word because we don't know what it means and therefore we're not sure how to translate it. Selah is used 74 times in the Old Testament, 71 times in the Psalms alone, and 3 times in Habakkuk. The most common understanding of this word is that it could be a musical term of some kind, indicating a direction for the music director, or that there should be a break in the singing and just the instruments should play, or that it might mean the word something to do with the concept of forever. In some translations, the word interlude or intermission is used. Now, the one understanding that combines some of these thoughts of Selah that I want us to consider is that it means to stop or to pause for a moment and consider. Think. So here in Psalm 77, Asaph is calling us 3 times to pause and consider. How often do you take the time to pause and consider? Whether it's because busyness helps make us feel important, or we're simply uncomfortable with quietness and inactivity, our tendency is to fill our lives with noise and activities that draw us physically and mentally, emotionally, socially, and even spiritually in every direction. It was thought early in this pandemic that the call for physical distancing and quarantine and so on would give us a chance to pause and consider, but has it? One meme I saw early during this COVID crisis said, church staff are trying to calculate how and why that no church building plus no in-person meetings plus quarantine equals twice as much work. And I know that's how I felt, and often I still continue to feel that way. God longs for us to take time and to pause and consider. It's in the quietness of our heart that He speaks to us most clearly. It's in the quietness of our hearts that we hear most clearly. We need to take time throughout the day, every day, to pause and to consider. Selah. Now in this psalm, Asaph gives us 4 thoughts divided up each time he calls us to Selah, where we need to pause and consider. In verse 1, he says, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. This opening section ends with Selah in verse 3. Where do you run to in times of trouble? Who do you go to when everything seems to be against you? Who do you cry out to when the world seems to be falling apart? Selah. The next section goes from verses 4 to 9. Verse 4 says, You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. And then continues to ask questions like, will the Lord reject forever? Will He never show His favor again? Has His unfailing love vanished forever? Now, these aren't simple rhetorical questions. This is the cry of someone wrestling with the difficult questions of life and sometimes the challenging questions of God. If we go back to Genesis 32, we read the story of how Jacob wrestled with God. And this wrestling match is symbolic of Jacob's struggle with his inner self. You see, God wanted to enter into a relationship with Jacob, but He couldn't do it until Jacob admitted his weakness of self-reliance, of deceit, and even trickery. When Jacob surrendered to God, it was only then he could admit his full and utter need for God. So we need to pause and consider if we have completely surrendered ourselves to God. Selah. The next section is from verses 10 to 15. And some of Asaph's thoughts include lines like, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. Your ways, God, are holy. What God is as great as our God? Do we pause and consider the faithfulness and righteousness and powerfulness of God? Or do we fall into panic and anxiety and worry every time difficulties and challenges come our way? What problem could we possibly have in life that God can't help us overcome? Sila. The final section goes from verses 16 to 20. And here Asaph moves from chaos to peace as he begins with, the waters saw you, God, and the waters saw you and writhed, to you lead your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Do we pause and consider and have confidence in the ability of God to turn chaos into order? Do we long for the presence and guidance of God in all areas of our lives? Sila. Today, let me encourage you to take time to Sila, pause and consider. And as we do so, may we find ourselves overwhelmed with the presence of God and the confidence, the hope, and the peace that comes only through knowing Him. Đại heng Jimoy, Joy Gin.